You could definitely feel optimistic and pessimistic depending on how you looked at it. COP26 did was kick the can down the road a little bit, but it did just enough to keep our hopes alive that we can, solve this problem. So COP26 went on for 2 weeks in Glasgow, and at the end there was a big, long and slightly rowdy session. About 196 countries from around the world agreeing the measures which all the different countries would take in order to reduce emissions and keep temperatures as low as possible. So the main things that were agreed in COP26 in the agreement are keeping on track for 1.5 degrees centigrade of global heating is really important. Before, they've also talked about 2 centigrade, which still seems quite low, but actually is being much more dangerous.
Hearing no objections, it is so decided.
And then really importantly, they also agreed that they were going to come back next year for some of the big emitting countries, which haven't really stepped up to the plate in terms of how much they're going to cut their carbon emissions. They need to come back and have another go. And if that hadn't been agreed in Glasgow, it might not have happened for a number of years. And in terms of the climate crisis, we're really short on time. It's not like turning a light on and off, right? You can't just say, oh, you want us to cut our emissions in half? Oh, fine, we'll just do it, right? We'll flick the switch and it's done. Like, you actually have to replace half of the cars in your country with electric vehicles and turn off half your power stations. You can't instantly reduce emissions. You have to have a plan to do it. Phasing out coal in different countries, getting rid of petrol and diesel-driven cars, reducing methane, agreeing really excitingly to end deforestation by 2030. So the big caveat with all of these is it's all voluntary. It all has to happen in future in order to have any effect at all. But to me, it felt like quite a sort of powerful signal that things are changing. There were a lot of people who felt that this COP wasn't very inclusive. Some people went as far to say this was the whitest COP that had ever happened, and that the voices of all the different groups you definitely want to hear from, indigenous groups, people from the global south, people working on gender issues and so on, their voices hadn't been heard quite as loudly. So again, that was a source of regret for quite a lot of people there in Glasgow.
Of indigenous communities have preserved more than 80% of Earth's remaining biodiversity. They are the most important stakeholders who've been ignored at COP26.
The thing that disappointed the most people was to do with something called loss and damage. And what this is about the impacts of climate change that are already happening through storms and droughts and floods and things like that. A lot of the people who suffer the most from these are in developing parts of the world. And often those countries have done very little to cause the problem. And so there's a real kind of moral anger there. But in the end, that grouping of poorer and more vulnerable countries didn't get what they wanted.
We cannot wait for speeches when the sea is rising around us all the time. Climate mobility must come to the forefront. We must take bold, alternative action today to secure tomorrow.
So another thing which was disappointing at COP26 was to do with money. Almost more than a decade ago, the rich countries around the world had promised that they would come up with $100 billion a year by 2020. And this was to allow poorer nations to develop, to enable their populations to become more comfortable, have better standards of living, but without building coal-fired power stations or gas-fired power stations and so on. The thing is that the rich countries never came up with that money. And it's obvious we're here in 2021, they still haven't, and probably won't make it till 2023. And that was definitely a sore point. The COP26 was a sort of minor success. It made a small step forward. In relative terms, we're slightly better off than we were 2 weeks ago.